There are many everyday sayings that have become ingrained in our thinking. They're proverbs of sorts that shape our culture and influence our actions. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with some of them. I'll show you. I'll start a sentence and you finish it. Where there's a will, yeah, but you know it. Finders keepers. Yep. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you want something done right, and how about this one? Don't get mad, get even. Have you ever felt like getting even? Maybe it was a family member who said something behind your back, or a coworker who wrongly accused you of something. You just wanted to settle the score. And maybe it was that kid in the Corvette who cut you off on the pike. You just wanted to ride his tail a little bit. We've all had moments when we've wanted to settle the score, to get even, to teach someone a lesson. The question I have for us this morning is, how do we respond when we've been wronged? When someone's done something that's offended us, that's wrongly accused us, how do we respond as believers in Jesus? Men and women throughout the centuries have struggled with this very question. Some have responded with armies of retaliation, some with silent protest. But I want us to think deeply this morning about how we respond when someone has wronged us. And I'm not here this morning to come up with a moralistic strategy of how to respond to those who oppose us. I want us this morning to look to the God of our salvation, the God of justice, who loves us, who redeems us, who speaks to us through His Word. And I think He has something to say about how we respond to those who oppose us. If you have your Bible, I invite you to open up to 1 Samuel chapter 25. 1 Samuel chapter 25. We continue this morning in a series which we've entitled Extraordinary. How God uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And if all of us are honest, there's many times in our lives where we feel just that, extraordinary. Like there's millions and billions of people on this globe living their lives, doing their thing, and we're just one of them. Do we have a role? Do we have a purpose? Is God able to use us to do extraordinary things? This morning we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 25 and we meet some ordinary people in different stages of life. In fact, we read in 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1, "Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Then David moved down to the desert of Paran." And now this gives us a little bit of the context of where we find ourselves, and I wonder what it was like when David got the news that Samuel had died. If Samuel had been a mentor to him. I wonder if David remembered the day that Samuel showed up there at his house. Jesse, his father, was there, and Samuel said, one of your sons is going to be the next king of Israel. I wonder if David remembered that firm but gentle hand of Samuel when he said, "You're the one." It was a time of unrest in the land of Israel. Samuel died because he was a prophet who was preparing Israel for greater things. And imagine as they gathered there in Ramah to mourn that there were a lot of questions running through their minds. You know, one of those times in life where the questions come to the surface and you wonder what's next. I'm sure David's asking some of those questions as well, because Samuel had told him, "You're going to be the king," but Saul was still king. And he was pretty unwilling to give up his spot as king. In fact, he was out for David. He was out to kill him. And so David has found himself in the wilderness, not as a reigning king, but a running fugitive. Sure, the questions are running through David's mind as Saul is out for his life. You see, in the midst of this time in the wilderness, God was preparing David. He had some lessons that David needed to learn to make him fit to be king. He was learning lessons of leadership, exercising his faith. And as Saul pursued David there in the wilderness, David was faced with a decision. He was faced with one of those questions. How do you respond when men oppose you? I mean, Saul is out for his life. And so here in 1 Samuel 25, that's where we find David. Here in the wilderness, asking some of those questions. We're introduced to someone else. He's a sheep shearer. He's there in the land of Carmel. He's a rather wealthy man, and his name is Nabal. We read in verse 2, "A certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel." Now, this description of wealth is rather foreign to us, but that's a lot of sheep and goats. Nabal is a rather wealthy man. And we find out that he is shearing his sheep. And David had sympathy with some of Nabal's men. You see, we learn later in the passage that some of Nabal's men they were shepherds taking care of these sheep, and while David and his men were in the wilderness, they encountered each other. And now David had a sympathy for shepherds because he too was once a shepherd. And so I imagine that factored into the situation as he protected some of Nabal's men when they came to him in the wilderness. He protected them, he gave them food, he provided anything they needed while they were there. And David now finds himself in a bit of a pinch. He's on the run, and I imagine feeding, 400 men in the wilderness who are on the run was sometimes a little challenging. So you had to rely on some of the generosity of people in the land. And so he sends some of his men to Nabal with a simple request. And he says to his men in verse 6, "Thus you shall greet him, long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that at sheep shearing time, when your shepherds were here with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you, and therefore be favorable to my men, since we have come at a festival time. Please give to your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." The request is simple. I lended generosity to your men. They missed nothing while they were among us. Could you give us a few leftovers? Could you lend a hand to me and my men? It was respectable. It was reasonable. I mean, surely a little help for an upcoming king would be no burden for a wealthy man. So David's men made their way through the wilderness to Nabal, and we're told that it was the festival of sheep shearing. Now this was like the harvest festival for shepherds. It was a big deal because this was the time when they would make their wool, they would shear their sheep. This was where all the wealth would come from. So it was a time of celebration. It was a festival. There was feasting. And so they finally make their way through the tents of celebration to find Nabal. And they found the tent where Nabal was feasting, and one of David's messengers stepped forward and said, "We come in the name of David, the son of Jesse." They delivered the request, just as David had told them. Imagine David's men kind of waited silently as they waited for Nabal to answer. Surely he would lend them a hand. And we read his response in verse 10. "Who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. Why should I take my bread and water and meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men who coming from who knows where?" The words were cold with insult. Not only did they refuse, was Nabal refusing to return a favor, he returned it with ridicule, calling David a runaway slave. David's men returned to him and reported what Nabal had said. How do you respond when foolish men oppose you? When an act of kindness is returned with ridicule? "Strap on your sword," David says. He goes to battle. He has 600 warriors, and he says, "Strap on your sword." He says, "If by morning I don't kill him and his household, may God do so." David is angry. He wants revenge. He's mad and he wants to get even. And so he and his 600 warriors, they hop on the road and head to Carmel because they are going to take revenge for the ridicule that Nabal had the audacity to repay. I kind of sympathize with David here. I mean, he has been crowned to be the next king. He has lended a hand of generosity, and here, in return for kindness, he receives ridicule. If he just knew who I am, imagine David thought to himself. Meanwhile, we're told, as the writer of 1 Samuel records this whole account for us, we're told that the men who had overheard the messengers arriving and talking to Nabal, some of Nabal's men, some of the shepherds who had received the kindness of David, they were a bit concerned about this whole situation. They knew that Nabal's response was bad news. So they knew they had to do something. So they ran to Abigail. Now, Abigail's another character in the story who is in stark contrast to Nabal, her husband. We're told that Abigail is a beautiful woman, wise and discerning. In stark contrast to Nabal, whose name literally means fool. One of the messengers found Abigail, and he told her everything that had happened. David's protection in the wilderness, their request for favor, and how Nabal's response of ridicule was a bit ridiculous. He said to her in verse 17, "Now think over it. Think it over and see what you can do. Because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man, no one can talk to him." We begin to see a bit more of Nabal's character. It's not just this response of ridicule, it's a lifestyle of wickedness. So Abigail doesn't waste any time. She gets in the kitchen. She knew time was of the essence, and she starts putting together some food, some supplies for David and his men. She knew revenge was on the way. She knew she needed to protect more than her life and the lives of her whole household. She needed to protect David from doing something he would regret. She gathered together loaves of bread, skins of wine, 5 prepared sheep, 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. I mean, this was a feast for David and his men. And she sends some men ahead of her, and she starts making her way to meet David before he would meet them with revenge. Imagine time seemed to stand still as Abigail and David come around the side of Mount Carmel, and they see each other approaching in the distance. David is on his way to take revenge on Abigail's household. I mean, her husband was the fool who ridiculed him. And Abigail ran ahead. She fell down on the ground. She cried out to David, "On me alone be the guilt." At this point, I imagine tears were flowing down her cheeks as she said to David, "Please hear my cry. My husband Nabal is worthless. His name means fool." That should give you a little clue to his character, but I didn't know about the men you sent. And she says, "As both you and the Lord live, because God has restrained you from blood guilt by taking revenge into your own hands, may God do to every enemy of yours as he does to Nabal." She says, don't take revenge in your own hands. Leave it to God. She motioned to the gifts she had prepared. She said, "Take this and forgive your servant." And it's almost as if in a prophetic voice, she says in verse 28, "The Lord make you a sure house." Not because of who you are, but because the Lord is fighting, my Lord, speaking of David, is fighting the battle of the Lord. "And evil shall not be found in you as long as you live." I imagine Abigail taking a bundle of twigs. Often they would, in that day, they would take twigs for the fire and they'd bundle them up. And she says to David, "If men rise up and seek your life, you shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. He will envelop and protect you. He will surround you with his arms of care." And as she continues, she says, "Your enemies shall be cast out like from the hollow of a sling." I imagine David's mind went back to that moment when he encountered Goliath. And from the hollow of his sling, the Lord brought victory. Abigail concluded, "You will be king as God promised in his goodness, and you will stand uncondemned, a conscience free from guilt, a life free from bloodshed, and as long as you do not take vengeance into your own hands." I imagine Abigail slowly lifted her head from the ground where she was bowed down before David, and she says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be your discretion." David says this, "Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand." David was going to take revenge in his own hands. He was going to settle the score. He was going to get even with Nabal. But he praised God because the wisdom and the grace and the initiative of Abigail stopped him from taking it into his own hands. You see, this was bigger than the moment. David was on his way to be king, and Abigail realized that if David took blood into his own hands, if he took revenge into his own hands, she realized that revenge doesn't right the wrong, it wrongs the righteous. Let me say that again. Revenge doesn't right the wrong, it only wrongs the righteous. She knew if David took revenge, it would make him unfit to be king. It would hinder his relationship with the Lord who had called him to be king. Abigail returned to her home and found Nabal feasting like a king. Yet another night. And so she waits. She lets Nabal eat, drink, and when he wakes up the next morning, she tells him what happened. She told him that David was going to avenge him, killing Nabal and the whole household. And we're told that as Abigail said these words, his eyes became glossy, and his heart became like a stone. He had a heart attack there, and 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. And God avenged Nabal's insults. And Abigail sent messengers to David to tell of God's provision of justice. And when David heard these words, he responded saying, "Blessed be the Lord who avenged the insult I received. I have been kept from wrongdoing, and evil has been repaid for evil. The Lord has settled the score." David sent men to Abigail to ask Abigail to be his wife. He took her as his wife and inherited the beauty and wisdom of Abigail and the possessions of the foolish Nabal. Now, we read this story in 1 Samuel 25, and we ask, okay, this is a bit of an extreme story. Now, what does this mean for you and me? And the truth of this passage, and the truth that God wanted David to learn here in his journey to become king, is that when foolish men oppose you, trust God to settle the score. And this is where we have to get in the whole grand picture of God's unfolding plan, that God says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, and we have to realize that revenge doesn't right the wrong, it only wrongs the righteous. And I'm struck as we look at 1 Samuel 25 how God used Abigail, a simple wife to a fool, who took initiative to make a difference in a situation that was headed in the wrong place. She took that simple initiative and she made a difference. She made a huge difference because she prevented David from blood guilt, and she helped prepare the king from whom Jesus would come one day. You see, when men and women rise up to pursue us and oppose us, we must hear the words of Abigail, "Your life shall be bound in the bundle of the living and the care of the Lord your God." Because he knows what it's like. He became a man, he was ridiculed, he was suffered insult and injury, and he was crucified for something he did not do, but he died to take the justice that we deserved. And so when foolish men rise up to oppose us, we as brothers and sisters in Jesus need to let trust God to settle the score. So when you're minding your own business, and that kid in the Corvette cuts you off on the pike, let's not take these matters into our own hands. Place your trust in the care of the God who has promised, justice is mine. We may not see it in our lifetime, but may we learn that lesson now. And if you're in Christ Jesus, He's made you righteous. So lay down the weapons of revenge and respond by resting in the hands of our Father who cares for you. And by His grace and for His glory, let's trust God to settle the score.